Good evening. It's a great pleasure for me and for SAIS Europe to welcome you to the 2026 Robert Mundell Lecture. It's, of course, very meaningful for us to be joined this evening by members of the Mundell family. And I want to say, Valerie, that your presence tonight continues a connection that is extremely important to our community. Robert Mundell was a member of our faculty in the early years of his career. It was here that he started to develop the work for which he would later receive the Nobel Prize. His theory of optimum currency areas and his analysis of monetary and fiscal policy under different exchange rate regimes. Mundell's scholarship laid the groundwork for understanding European monetary integration, institutionalized in the European Central Bank, now led by President Lagarde. But his work is also essential to understand the weaknesses of EMU as it was created. For we know that the euro area fell short of the criteria for an optimal currency area. And still today, it doesn't meet them. Yet, it has significantly advanced in that direction, due to no small part to the institution chaired by President Lagarde. Mundell stayed very closely linked to SAIS Europe throughout his life. Long after receiving the Nobel Prize, he returned to Bologna each year for this very lecture. And he came not as a distant laureate, but as a colleague and as a teacher, engaging with our students, debating ideas with the intellectual vitality that defined him. To this day, no student can graduate from SAIS without engaging with his ideas. That's perhaps the clearest testament to their enduring relevance. Of course, we gather at a moment when the questions Mundell posed feel newly urgent. Economic fragmentation, inflationary pressures, technological transformation, and last but not least, geopolitical instability, all test the resilience of our institutions. The recent escalation of conflict in the Middle East reminds us how quickly tensions can intensify and how closely energy, security, and financial stability are intertwined. It's therefore especially meaningful that we have the honor to welcome today President Christine Lagarde. Since 2019, she has led the European Central Bank, guiding the euro area through extraordinary circumstances, from the pandemic to energy shocks and geopolitical turbulence. She represents the euro system on the global stage, including the G7 and the G20. And as everyone knows, previously served as managing director of the International Monetary Fund and in a number of important ministerial positions in her country, France, notably as Minister of Economy and Finance. And it may be useful to point out that in all these positions, she was the first woman to serve in such important roles. Her leadership reflects the very connection that this lecture embodies, the connection between the world of scholarship on the one hand and the world of institutional responsibility. To welcome her here in Bologna in a lecture honoring Robert Mundell creates a powerful continuity between a scholar whose ideas have been and remain so influential in debates about monetary integration and the leader entrusted with safeguarding it. Madam President, we're really deeply honored by your presence tonight. Please join me in welcoming President Lagarde.
Monsieur le recteur de Hous, Madame Mandel, membres de la famille Mandel, Mesdames et Messieurs les professeurs, Monsieur le directeur de l'Université de Bologne, Mesdames et Messieurs les étudiants, promised I will speak English. My dear friend. So thank you so much for your words of introduction, and thank you for establishing the link between the eminent scholar and the institution that owes him so much. This lecture bears the name of Robert Mundell, and I'm especially honored that members of his family are attending this lecture and are present with us tonight. Thank you so much for being here with us. As Professor de Hoos just reminded, Bob Mundell is the father of optimum currency area theory. But there is a deep irony in how that theory was applied when it came to the launch of the common currency. Some of you probably don't remember because you're way too young, but others might. A time when the Euro's critics, mostly from across the pond or the channel, took his 1961 framework and turned it against the very project he believed in most. Europe lacked labor mobility. It had no fiscal transfers. It faced asymmetric shocks. Languages were different from one member state to the other. By Mundell's own criteria, they argued monetary union in Europe could not work. What they missed was that Bob Mundell had moved beyond his own early framework. In his later work, he argued something much bolder, that the common currency would in and of itself be a force for integration. One who certainly read him, by the way, is Jacques Delors. That it would deepen financial markets, enable new forms of risk sharing, and over time, generate the conditions of its own success. 25 years later on, quarter of a century, the evidence is on his side, not on the other side. The path has not been smooth, as we all know, and the work is not finished, as we also know. But the direction of travel has vindicated his conviction that the euro could actually thrive. The euro has driven exactly the kind of deepening that he had predicated. Much of my own career as a lawyer, not as an economist, as a lawyer, including in the private sector for 25 years of my life, has been devoted to the building process he set in motion. So in delivering this lecture in his name, in the place where he worked and studied, I feel a particular sense of connection. And it is fitting to deliver this lecture in Italy because it is here in Italy that the modern concept of risk was born. Not just the financial instruments, the insurance contracts, the double entry bookkeeping, but something more fundamental, the idea that an opaque future could be made knowable through observation and reason. Before the Italian Renaissance, the unknown was largely understood as fate, destiny, providence, forces beyond human comprehension. Galileo overturned that belief in natural sciences. insisting that the universe could be tested and understood. But the revolution began even earlier in commerce. In the merchant cities of Venice, Genoa, and Firenze, scholars and merchants began to believe that if you observed enough during voyage, you could discern patterns in what had previously seemed random or fate. You could measure danger and actually price it. And through measurement, you could tame the unknown itself. Luca Pacioli, a Franciscan friar working just a few hundred kilometers from here, published the first systematic account of this new approach in 1494. The very word, forgive my pronunciation, risico, entered European languages from Italian maritime trade. That insight was powerful and for centuries remarkably durable. It underpinned modern finance, probability theory, and ultimately the quantitative frameworks on which central banks and policymakers still rely today. But today, we have a sense that this approach is reaching its limits. The global order that we have lived under for decades is being upended. New technologies look set to reshape our economies. The defining feature of this moment is not simply that risks are rising, and they are. It is that we are leaving a world where risk could be measured and modeled, and the sense of entering one of genuine, sustainable uncertainty. This instinct, the natural one, to turn inward when the future becomes unclear, is not surprising. But I will argue this evening with you that acting on it would make the situation worse for all of us, cutting off the very gains our economies most need. So bear with me. So how do we travel from risk to uncertainty? The Italian merchants who invented risk measurements succeeded because the world they operated in had a broadly stable underlying structure. Trade routes were dangerous, yes, but the dangers were recurring. Even storms followed seasonal patterns. By recording outcomes systematically, they could estimate probabilities and put a price on a danger. That is the essence of risk. A stable enough system that past outcomes can guide future decisions. And for most of the last 30 years, if we fast forward, we also lived in such a world. The trading system was anchored by multilateral rules. The monetary framework rested on credible central banks. The geopolitical order provided a predictable backdrop. Within that structure, historical data could guide policymakers. We could model distributions and calibrate policy to ensure against shocks. Even when severe disruptions occurred, they remained, in an important sense, shocks within a stable structure. Think about it. The Asian financial crisis, the dot-com crash, even the global financial crisis of 2008. Each tested the system severely, sometimes threatening it, but the underlying architecture of the global economy actually held. I fear that we are no longer in this world. We are moving into a world of uncertainty, where risk is far more difficult to measure. This is what the economist Frank Knight defined as the condition you face when the underlying structure itself is shifting, when the system that generated yesterday's data may not be the system generating tomorrow's outcome. The shock we now face are themselves transforming the structure itself. A pandemic exposed the fragility of global supply chains and triggered a lasting shift towards reshoring or friendshoring. Russia's invasion of Ukraine redrew the map of Europe's security, and the global trading system itself has become a site of conflict as dependencies are exploited and trade policy is wielded as a weapon. The pace of change itself is striking. WTO monitoring shows the share of G20 trade affected by new tariffs and import restrictions rose more than fourfold between October 24 and October 25, the largest jump since monitoring those shocks. At the same time, we are witnessing the most significant technological shift since electrification. I know it's a big statement to make, and there are lots of people who are going to argue, "Boo, not at all. Artificial intelligence is not even as good as the washing machine." Well, I have my doubt. 3 years ago, remember? Yeah, some of you say yes. Yes, we all do. Broadly accessible AI models did not exist. First ChatGPT was 3 years ago. Today, AI is driving an unprecedented build out of data centers and energy infrastructure across all continents, and looks set to profoundly reshape industrial processes and labor markets. I just want a little show of hands here. Who has never used either ChatGPT, Gemini, Perplexity, Claude Work, and what have you? Who has never used that? Okay, you're okay. You're okay. But I just want everybody else to note that in this beautiful room full of smart people, only 2 have decided not to use this. And it's probably as a result of their determination, not randomly. Interesting. But it's okay. So these 2 forces, technological transformation and geopolitical fragmentation, pull, in my view, in opposite directions. One could dramatically raise our growth potential and increase our productivity. The other, so that's of course the technological transformation. The other one, the geopolitical fragmentation, could dramatically lower our growth potential. The result is a range of possible outcomes wider than anything we have faced in decades. On one estimate, AI, and there are quite a few of them, and there's a range, no question. But AI could possibly lift the annual productivity growth by up to 1.5 percentage point, an effect that we have not seen since the early 20th century. On another, severe fragmentation could reduce global output by 7% of GDP over a decade, equivalent to the combined economies of France and Germany. With aging populations, rising investment needs, and limited fiscal space across most of the advanced world, where the world economy ends up between those 2 outcomes, increased productivity, significantly reduced outcome, could hardly matter more. So how can we act with this kind of uncertainty? Traditional macroeconomic models are not a sufficient guide, and I have full respect for those models and for those who produce them. They cannot be a sufficient guide because they were calibrated on a world that may no longer exist, one of stable trade relationships and without a technology as pervasive and as fast as artificial intelligence. But I believe that there are 2 ways forward. The first is to make our models better at handling uncertainty, which is exactly what we are doing at the ECB. We have complemented our baseline forecast with more systematic use of scenario analysis, which allows us to explore alternative futures without relying solely on past data. We began this practice during the pandemic and have since published scenarios capturing other dimensions of the new environment. We scenarioized a cutoff of Russian gas. This one might be interesting. An escalation of conflict in the Middle East. This one might be interesting as well. The effect of trade fragmentation. We had no idea in 2023, but this one is becoming very interesting. And higher defense spending, Also interesting. Now, these scenarios have sharpened our understanding of how events might unfold. For example, in March 2022, just weeks after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, our baseline projected inflation at around 5% for that year, 2022. The adverse scenario, because typically we did a positive scenario and an adverse scenario. The adverse scenario we published alongside already pointed to inflation exceeding 7%, close to what was eventually the final figure for the euro area of 8%. That's one avenue, and that's one that we have pursued and will continue to pursue. But the second avenue, which I think we have to be prepared for, is to look beyond the data window our models use. Because if the recent past is no longer informative, we need to look further back and further out. Further back to episodes where the forces at work more closely resemble our present. This will not predict specific outcomes, but it can at least illustrate the dynamics at work and the dangers ahead. And if we look at the constellation in front of us, extraordinary technological changes unfolding alongside an erosion, at least an erosion of global integration, there is a striking parallel in not so long ago history. And that period dates back a century. The 1920s delivered a wave of general purpose technologies. Just to name a few, the internal combustion engine transformed transportation in all advanced economies. Assembly lines revolutionized manufacturing processes. Electrical networks brought power to factories and to home, just to name three of those big breakthrough transformations. In the United States at the time, output per worker in manufacturing nearly doubled between 1919 and 1929. This technological optimism spilled into stock markets, fueling a wave of what Greenspan would have called irrational exuberance. The Dow Jones at the time rose nearly sixfold between 1921 and 1929. But in parallel, the international environment was fracturing. The pre-1914 era of open trade and capital flows, what historians call today the first globalization, had been shattered by the Great War. World trade as a share of global GDP, which had risen to about 21% in 1913, fell back to around 14% in 29 and later dropped to just 9%. For much of the decade, technology and fragmentation appeared to develop on separate tracks. Many general-purpose technologies could diffuse through domestic infrastructure and national supply chains. But fragmentation still exacted a heavy toll. War debts, the Germans will pay. That's a quote from history. This is not what I'm saying today. Don't get me wrong. War debts and reparation poisoned international financial relations throughout the entire decade, making cross-border capital flows fragile and politically contested. The damage came through a different channel, destroying the economic conditions in which their gains could be broadly realized. When confidence finally broke, first with the Wall Street crash of 1929, then with a wave of bank failures across Europe, the absence of an international functioning order contributed to turning what might have been a severe recession into the Great Depression. There was no framework left to coordinate a response or prevent the retaliatory spiral that followed, the smooth-Hawley tariffs and the descent into economic nationalism. This is the pattern that history reveals. What looked like two independent forces was actually a single compounding risk that eventually materialized. Technology and the international order were deeply interconnected, And yet policymakers in the 20s acted as if they were separate domains. Markets priced technological gains as if they could be sustained in a fracturing world. Policymakers allowed the trading system to fragment as if it would not constrain growth. That pattern that we observed in history should shape our thinking today. When two forces of this magnitude develop simultaneously, we should assume that they interact. And we should ask whether capturing the upside of one requires managing the downside of the other. Today, financial markets do not seem to see this. In 25, the Standard & Poor's 500 hit record high after record high, even as effective US tariff rates reached their highest level since the 1930s. But the link between technology and the international order is actually far tighter today than it was a century ago. And that's the third part of my remarks tonight, where I want to demonstrate to you why AI cannot be separated from the global economy and can actually either help or hinder. In the 1920s, fragmentation damaged the economy around the technology. Today, it attacks the inputs on which AI itself depends through three channels. And those three channels are each critically important in order to allow for this AI to actually prosper and develop and be a force for good if we do the job properly in terms of policy. So first channel, AI is uniquely dependent on physical trade. Now that comes as a bit of a shock because we all think, okay, well, this is entirely digital and virtual, and no, it depends on physical trade. And that trade relies on a highly concentrated multi-country supply chain. The automotive industry, Ford in the old days, in the 20s, could vertically integrate within Michigan, didn't even have to go across to Canada. The chips that power AI cannot. China refines around 90% of critical minerals and rare earths indispensable for the purpose of building those chips. The Netherlands, ASML, is the unique supplier of the EUV lithography, which is needed to actually make those wafers and chips. Advanced chip design is concentrated where? In the United States, and final fabrication is dominated by TSMC in Taiwan. One estimate finds that building self-sufficient semiconductor supply chains, so vertical integration in that particular area, across each major region, so everybody goes back to their turf and think, I don't want to depend on anybody else. I'm going to do that at home. That would cost, according to those estimates, over $1 trillion in upfront investment alone, and raise prices by 35 to 65%. And that's not including the maintenance cost arising out of that investment effort. So what do countries do? Well, they trade instead. And the scale is striking. In 2025, around 42% of the increase in global good trade was linked to AI-related investment. AI is driving a resurgence in goods trade at precisely the moment when fragmentation threatens to sever it. That was the first channel. We move to the second channel. AI needs market scale to justify its economics and its business model. Training an AI model runs now towards the $1 billion mark. But once trained, the marginal cost of deployment is near zero. That business model only functions if developers can spread those fixed costs across a vast global market. To give you an example, the EU today accounts for 1/5 of the global AI markets And US technology leaders, predominantly the hyperscalers, derive an estimated 20 to 30% of their total revenues from where? From Europe. So if markets fragment through divergent standards, through data localization, through outright restrictions, the investment logic would collapse. Unlike Ford in the 20s, a national AI champion cannot survive on domestic demand alone. Third channel, AI scales with data diversity, and fragmentation directly degrades it. Frontier models learn from vast information spanning varied languages, institutions, and real-world context. Research shows that larger and more diverse training data produces materially better results even when computing power is held constant. When data is restricted by localized requirements or incompatible privacy regime, models become parochial and brittle, performing well on familiar situations and tasks, but failing on the edge cases of a global economy. So fragmentation degrades the intelligence of the technology itself. So to summarize, in the 20s, technology could keep delivering for a time, even as the international order frayed. With AI, even that window may be much narrower. The technology's dependence on global integration is so direct that fragmentation would begin to erode it almost immediately. The more AI becomes central to global growth, the more geopolitical fragmentation becomes systemically costly. And this leads to a paradox that we cannot ignore. At precisely the moment when the case for international cooperation is the strongest, when the potential gains from integrations are larger than at any point in living memory, the will to cooperate is at its weakest. That is a mistake. Every major economy, including that of the United States, has a direct and urgent interest in containing fragmentation, not accentuating it. Not out of attachment for the global order, but because the alternative is economic self-harm. So how do we act on that interest in a world where uncertainty is so high? Robust strategies under uncertainty have a common feature. They do not depend on any single assumption holding true. They build on layers so that if one layer fails, the other ones hold. The approach I want to outline has 3 such layers, each valuable on its own, but together providing the resilience that uncertainty requires. The first layer is the broadest, in a way the simplest. Reforming the global institutions that already represent today our common denominator. As I argued recently at Columbia University, we should not be drawn into the fatalism about the international order that currently prevails. It's easy to say, oh, wipe it out. Yeah. Nearly all countries today are part of the International Monetary Fund. Nearly all countries are today part of the World Bank, and 166 countries around the world are part of the WTO. That is a hard-won foundation on which we should be building, not destroying. Fixing, not denying. Yes, the multilateral system has serious, real flaws. I spent 8 years of my life heading the IMF. I've experienced it, I know. But the answer is to fix the issues, not to abandon the institution. And this is not just the view of a few or of the multilateralists, the idealists. No. Even the United States has put forward some concrete reform proposals for the WTO in particular. Those who dismiss this approach as naive should consider what they are offering instead. The balance of power model has been tried before. The history that I have described should remind us how it ended badly. The second layer is narrower and not as simple. It requires deeper cooperation amongst allies. It is difficult, and we should be honest about it. Alliances are under strain. Trust between partners who once took each other for granted has eroded. But focusing on supply chains could actually break out of the zero-sum logic that is currently driving us apart. When each partner can see that their own prosperity depends on what others uniquely provide, cooperation is not reaching out to the others. It is self-interest. Consider the semiconductors. As I mentioned earlier, no single country, however powerful, can command the full stack of capabilities that AI demands. If they want to reduce their vulnerability to the parts of the supply chain controlled by rivals, they have to work more closely with allies that hold indispensable positions. That requires a common strategy. Procurement rules and content requirements that favor supply chains running through allied countries, coordinated export controls that prevent leakages of critical technologies, and joint investment in the research that will define the next generation of choke points. My third and final layer, that one is difficult, it's the hardest, is minimum viable cooperation amongst rivals. It requires working with countries that you actively distrust. But it may also be the most important layer, because the greatest fragmentation risks run through relationships between rivals. We have a partial precedent. Arms control during the Cold War did not depend on trust between the United States and the Soviet Union. It depended on the principle of trust but verify, mutual vulnerability, and a shared recognition that the alternative was worse. Economic interdependence is harder because the vulnerabilities are not symmetric. Right now, a restriction on Chinese critical raw materials could shut other economies down within weeks. That is precisely why building allied cooperation in parallel is so important. The less exposed we are to coercion, the more credibly we can negotiate. But even with those efforts, significant risks associated with this interdependence will remain, and we need frameworks to manage it. Now, this is putting a bit of a creative thinking on. You could imagine something like a critical supply chain accord. Major economies committing to maintain baseline flows of essential inputs even during periods of tension, subject to transparent monitoring and clear consequences for violation. Trust but verify, respect the rules, sanction if that doesn't work. AI itself may offer more promising ground. Whatever our rivalries, no country has an interest in AI systems that destabilize financial markets, escape effective human control, and start to hallucinate, or expose their citizens to large-scale fraud and manipulation. That should make it possible to negotiate a basic code of conduct, even amongst rivals, starting with transparency on the most dangerous capabilities and mechanisms to manage incidents before they escalate. And this is a domain where I am convinced that public actors and private sectors can and must cooperate. None of this will be easy, but it is where the cost of failure is the highest. Together, the three layers provide the resilience that a world of genuine uncertainty demands. Multilateral reforms will move slowly. Allied coalitions will face political setbacks. Cooperation with rivals will be tested by every escalation. But if one layer weakens, the others must hold. That is the logic of layered cooperation, and it is the most robust response we have given the uncertainty of our time. In 1347, Genovese merchants were confronted with political fragmentation across the Mediterranean, which rendered trade unpredictable. Corsairs, pirates, disrupted trade routes, and rival city-states competed violently. In response, they drafted the first known insurance contract as a means of sharing risks across borders. This enabled merchants to pool their exposure and continue trading, even when the future could not be predicted. They recognized that in times of uncertainty, cooperation becomes more valuable and is in their self-interest. I think we face a similar choice today. We can repeat the errors of the 1920s, treating technology and geopolitics as separate tracks until they inevitably collide. Or we can embrace layered cooperation, recognizing that in an era of systemic uncertainty, the most robust strategy is resilient integration, starting with strengthening the lowest common denominator. And I circle back to Robert Mundell. Was he certain that it was going to work? Maybe you will tell us. But probably not. Yet he had the decisive determination and the understanding that there was no alternative, and that was the route to pursue. This is my conviction today. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Alessandro Merli, and I'm a fellow here at SAIS Europe. Thank you, President Lagarde, for your very thought-provoking lecture. You touched issues and made connections that we don't often hear from a central banker. Unusual, I would say, in a sense. I could say that it was a truly Mandelian speech, if I may say so, because Bob Mandel was, of course, a giant of economics. He wrote the model through which we still understand the way the international economy functions, but he was not an ivory tower economist. He looked at the world with wide eyes, huge intellectual curiosity, looked at different themes from different angles, a bit like you did tonight. And he always confronted reality, not just the theory. In his writings, in his public interventions, and for those of us who were privileged to have those in private conversations. I see Michael Plummer here in the second row, who was very familiar with this long conversation with Bob Mandel. I will not try, like academic discussants do in academic conference, to summarize the presentation. It would be presumptuous of me. I will just recall what Rector de Hoo said, and you, of course, mentioned in your speech, the extraordinary sequel of challenges that the world economy and the ECB faced in the 6.5 years you have been at the helm of the ECB. So you had to lead the ECB through totally uncharted, extremely turbulent waters. It's a good thing you're an excellent swimmer. You even managed to get your governing council colleagues to synchronize, which is not a minor accomplishment. President Lagarde has kindly agreed to take some questions and answer some of our questions, and our tradition is that the students always go first. They have a unique opportunity to have a dialogue with one of preeminent European and global policymakers of our day. And so I'll ask our students to please raise your hands, identify yourself by name and nationality. keep it simple and short because we want to give as many people as possible the chance to ask questions to Madame Lagarde. And there are roving mics, so they will reach you. So if you could please raise your hands and I'll take some of your questions. Robert, you go first. Just wait for the mic for a second. Yes.
Right. Hello, President Lagarde. Thank you very much for your remarks this evening. My name is Robert Thomas. I'm from the United States. You've spoken, I think, very convincingly about some of the key sources of fragmentation and uncertainty that we face in the world today. And of course, many of them are fast moving. We've seen key developments in trade policy and in conflict in the Middle East just within the last few weeks that have continued to keep policymakers and markets on their toes. And I would love to hear some of your thoughts on whether the ECB's monetary policy making functions and the broader economic policy functions and institutions of the European Union are appropriately equipped to deal with these fast-moving sources of fragmentation and uncertainty today, if there are any key reforms that you see as necessary, and if the wake-up call has gotten through to the key policymakers who need to make those reforms.
Well, thank you very much for your question, Robert Thomas. You have the first name of my father and your last name that of my son. So I'm quite touched that you asked the first question. So, as you know, we have conducted monetary policy in the last 6.5 years under very troubled circumstances, but with a structure that held in spite of the crisis that we faced and that eventually compounded over the course of that period of time. And it required a significant increase of interest rates, followed by a holding period, which was then followed by a period of cuts. And I have repeatedly said, who are you? Okay. So I have repeatedly said that our monetary policy was in a good place. Why do I say that? Because we have inflation as we have defined it in our strategy, which is symmetry 2% medium term. We have inflation at target. The latest reading was 1.9 for inflation in the last month, but our medium-term target is at 2%. We have interest rate at 2%. And if you look at the publication from our staff at the ECB, we are within the range of this neutral rate where we are neither accommodative nor restrictive. That's point number one. And I think that when you face additional shocks, additional uncertainty, it's certainly more convenient and more appropriate to be in a good place than to be in a less good place. The second point that we have determined in our strategy review and also in the most recent discussion about our stance is that we would decide our monetary policy on a meeting-by-meeting basis in view of all the data that we can harness and that we can analyze and that we can scrutinize with sufficient confidence, and that there was no preset pace for our monetary policy stance. And I think that if you bring these two elements together, it places the ECB and the Euro system in a good position to monitor very carefully and to try to understand what the consequences of the current shocks will be in the future. I don't think that any particular reform as far as the ECB or the Euro system is concerned is required at this point in time. That reforms be needed, with or without wake-up call, by the way, is obviously the case. And from a structural point of view, from a fiscal point of view, there are efforts underway under the leadership and the authority of other institutions like the European Commission, like the European Parliament, like the European Council. And for having participated in some of those meetings, I can assure you that the sense of urgency is there, and hopefully the momentum will continue, if not accelerate. Thank you. Robert Thomas.
Right. So we have Cara there in the middle.
Do you know all the students by their first name?
Oh, well, you know, it takes a lot of work.
I'm impressed.
My name is Kara, and I'm from China. I'm a first-year international student here. My question would be regard to the world order right now. Earlier this year at Davos Forum this year, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney mentioned that we're right now in a state of rupture rather than transition, and the previous international order has already collapsed. And basically, you expressed disagreement with that. So my question would be, if the economic and trade interdependence is still functioning, although a little bit weak, as you mentioned, how do we interpret the phenomenon that right now a lot of European countries and other economies are hedging their strategic alignment? Is this a kind of signal of fragmentation, or do you interpret as just a rational option in a still functioning world?
Well, thank you very much for your very articulate question. I would go for the latter, actually, because when you look at the various trade agreements that have been concluded in the last few weeks only, whether it's with the Mercosur arrangement, Mexico just recently, India, of course, Indonesia, and I'm sure I'm missing some of them, and there are negotiations underway. It's not just hedging. But it's the affirmation of the fact that trade is an indispensable link between nations, and one that can reinforce our respective economies. I think this is vastly acknowledged by all those who participated in these trade agreements. Going back to the first part of your question, I don't think that it is inconsistent or mutually exclusive to acknowledge that there are rupture points in relationships, and continuing to believe that my three layers that I have explained to you in my remarks can actually be used in order to reframe the relationship between member states and between countries of the world. I would observe also that at the moment, despite the fact that we have seen rupture points that are concerning, over 70% of trade is still conducted under WTO rules. So I don't think that we should, reach the conclusion that, the whole thing is broken. No, the whole thing needs fixing. And I think in a way, the economy itself and the technology that is transforming and will transform our economies is pushing us in that direction. If we fail to deliver on that front as policymakers, the technological transformation that we will see is going to be probably a short and pale vision of what it could be, and it might be a one that is not a force for good, but that is turned towards less than good purposes. And I think we should have that in the back of our mind as well.
Colby here on the fourth or fifth row. Yes.
Thank you very much for being with us tonight, Ms. Lagarde. My name is Colby Cunningham. I am from the United States. Within your discussion, I very much enjoyed your talk about the physical component of artificial intelligence. And on that note, my question for you is, in a world where payment systems, cloud infrastructure, and AI platforms are dominated by non-European firms, does technological dependence pose risks to Europe and particularly to its monetary sovereignty? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have to say thank you to you especially because, sometimes in an audience, you have hostile looks or you have sort of chagrined sight. But I could feel with your smile that I was communicating with you. So thank you. It's always helpful. You will be speakers. Well, you are speakers, professors, but students, you will be speakers. It's always good to have one person in the room that is expressing a little bit of sympathy. Very helpful. So, this is not a new phenomenon. And, in my position as president of the ECB, when I joined after 8 years as head of the IMF, I was utterly convinced that we had, and the situation was very different 6.5 years ago. I have always been convinced that we need to never be totally dependent on a solution over which we have zero control. And I think in my field, which currently is payment infrastructures in particular, it is our duty, it is my duty as head of the institution to make sure that we have a European alternative over which we have control. And that's the reason why we're pushing very hard to make sure that we have both in wholesale and in retail sale, a CBDC that we call the digital euro for retail purposes, but both wholesale and retail. And that's indispensable. I think we could have the same debate on cloud. Now, I'm not going to venture there because I'm not as much of an expert on that, but on payment and payment infrastructure, I'm convinced. And it doesn't mean to say that we want to exclude, that we want to boycott, that we want to run down existing systems. It's simply a response to a world where the trust can erode, the friend can turn foe, and you want to have some control over your destiny. Thank you.
Jason, next to you. Pass the mic, please.
Thank you. Thank you for your remarks. I'm Deshan from France, Avignon.
I'm from Villeneuve.
Nice.
It's across the river.
To go back on Colby's point about the digital euro, I wanted to ask you about how you would see the progress in the savings and investments union of the EU and the capital markets that have been kind of stalling in a way. How do you see the Europe being able to manage the sort of preventing from leakages that you kind of mentioned to have that unified financial market?
Yeah, excellent question. Actually, it tails back to Robert's question in a way when you were asking for whether the reforms was sufficient drive at the moment. So I go back to many years ago, in the days when my good friend Jean-Claude Juncker identified Capital Market Union as a required direction in which we had to go. And for the last 10 years, we have heard a bit of the same rhetoric about the value and the virtue of the Capital Market Union. That's how we called it in those days. I think there is a definite change of pace. There is a definite change of process. And I think that this is a field where we all are going to have to watch what happens in the course of 2026. Because the Commission, under the leadership of Ursula von der Leyen, I think has understood that it has to move fast. So to give you an example, the common supervision, which would see ESMA extending its authority and having the capacity to supervise with the same interpretation of the regulation, not the directive, of CCPs or CSDs or of large systemic institutions, that has to be completed by the end of 2026. That's one component of the saving and investment unions. The pension additional instrument is also something that now the Commission has put on the table and which is up for debate. Now, where President Prodi would understand what I'm talking about here is how the cooperation with an active Commission and the Parliament and the European Council works fast and efficiently. That's where we need to watch, and we need to apply public opinion pressure to make sure that the machine delivers. When it's activated in the right direction, it's unbelievably efficient. If not, if you have forces that will try to drag on the process. It will be laborious, it will be tedious, and all the excitement that it can generate when it announces will gradually abate. And in 3 years' time, we'll say, oh, we're talking about the saving and investment unions yet again. I hope this is not the case. But I'll give you an example. These things take time, and they should take time, but not too much time. Why should it take time? Because it has to bring everyone around the table, or as many as possible, if not everyone. And that is a process that requires, bringing everyone. The example that I want to give you is that of the digital euro. We started 6 years ago. And I know that when my term expires in October 2027, the digital euro will only be in pilot phase, not yet rolled out. So it's frustrating, but I'm not giving up, and we should not give up. Hopefully, with what is happening around us and the level of uncertainty that has risen as it has, and maybe the support of technology, we will be able to move faster. But that's so hope.
We go all the way to the back. Ariana, yes, please stand up.
Hi, President Lagarde. My name is Ariana Rue, and I'm a student from the United States. I wanted to ask you about the wide range of economic futures that you spoke about and their links to AI, and specifically what your perspective is given the wide range of economic perspectives that exist out there now, like from Kevin Warsh, the recently nominated Fed chair, and his perspective that AI will lead to this boom in productivity growth without spiking inflation and thus leading to lower interest rates. And then those who are more weary of AI's implications, especially in regards to labor market and if labor markets, and what your message is to those of us who are, weary of what an AI future could look like and worsening inequalities that could come from that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I think it's you're opposing, I think, what we see at the moment as a theory of enhancement and the theory of displacement. And the jury is out as to exactly what will come out of those two approaches. We are trying to understand as well as possible and as factually as possible what impact artificial intelligence has. So to do that, we rely on surveys. We have something that is called the consumer survey. We have the access to financing survey, where we have ramification in not only in the consumer world, but also in the small enterprises and the large corporates. And we try to understand from them how they perceive the diffusion of artificial intelligence and how it is going to affect the work processes, the data flows, and whether it will have an impact on the labor force. At this point in time, I'm not capable of telling you which direction it will take. There is a degree of uncertainty as to which task will be affected, and how the framework within which artificial intelligence operate will lead towards this displacement or enhancement. I'll give you an example. It's one that is often mentioned by one of the big hyperscaler, and how artificial intelligence can actually, not completely, but largely substitute the reading by radiologists of scans and X-rays. Yet, the predicament that radiologist would be reduced by at least half has not materialized. Because, for instance, a lot of insurance companies, a lot of prescribers require that the reading that is done by artificial intelligence be actually supplemented and authenticated by physical persons who are radiologists. That's just one example where we can very well see more enhancement than displacement. Second example, there are categories of professionals where we always assume that it would be displacement. Software developers, coders, legal clerks, and notarial services. In most of these categories of people, there is a degree of protection, of regulatory environment, which actually protects their work. On the other hand, you look at those that we had not suspected would be affected, people working in logistics, people with very limited protection, where actually artificial intelligence is penetrating their world and not so much enhancing, but displacing. So to understand exactly what is going on and what will go on as a result of the intrusion and diffusion of AI, I think what is going to be required is a very granular analysis and understanding of which categories, which sectors, which data flows will be impacted by AI. Are we in the world of Alan Greenspan, where productivity jump actually led to this world of higher GDP and stable inflation? I'm not so sure, but future will tell. Thank you.
Hi, Ms. Lagarde. Thank you for your talk. I'm Jus Bruin from the Netherlands. Uncertainty was a big theme in your talk, and one of the things that are currently uncertain is the dominance of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Countries like China may be trying to diversify away from the dollar, and with the ECB recently announcing euro swaps to facilitate liquidity, my question is, how can the euro become maybe a reserve currency, or what does the ECB needs to do in order for the euro to claim a bigger role on the world stage?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for paying attention to our latest developments. I'm really honored. Thank you. But I will qualify a little bit what you said. I'll tell you why. So, preface to what I'm really interested in, which is what are we doing? Because I've given enough speeches and I want to do something. So you don't become the international currency of reserve just like that. You have to earn that position. And it happens over the course of time. So there is no question in my mind that at the moment, the dollar still holds that dominant position in the world of currencies. If you look at how much reserves national central banks hold, little under 60% dollars, little over 20% euros, and other currencies underneath. If you look at the invoicing, we are on a par. In international trade, euro is the currency of invoicing for 40% of trade, dollar 40%. We're on a par. But again, it has to be earned. And for that, it's a question of credibility. It's a question of military strength, because there is no currency that becomes dominant if it does not have the strength and the capacity, both in economic terms and military terms as well. And we are not there. Now, what can we do as a central bank to make sure that, if not a dominant currency, at least a strong currency, one that is respected the world over? I think we can and have done three things. One is you need a strong and credible institution. And I'm very proud to lead an institution that is independent. I have never, ever received a phone call from any leader in Europe, let alone from the president of the Commission or the president of the European Parliament, to say, hey, why don't you cut, or why don't you hike, or why don't you do a bit more of this, a bit less of that? Never. So the ECB is totally independent. That's point number one. Point number two, we need to have a currency that is fit for the future. And in that respect, to have a central bank digital currency for wholesale and retail payments is critically important, and we will continue to march forcefully in that direction. And the third one is exactly what you referred to, and this is something that we announced last week that will be implemented as of the 1st of June, 2026. And it's not a swap line, it's a repo line. So in a swap line, you exchange a currency for your currency. In a repo line, you exchange your currency for collaterals that is safe and solid. And up until now, we had repo lines that were available within the European Union and the economic area, not beyond that. We have now decided that our repo lines would be available to all national central banks around the world. unless the national central banks does not comply with anti-money laundering, finance terrorism and all that, the usual suspects. But otherwise, all national central banks are eligible. What does that? We do that for monetary purposes. Monetary transmission is facilitated if people have access to euros. But eventually, it also helps those people in the trade in those countries to appreciate that they can invoice and they can pay in dollars, because in case of crisis, their national central banks will have access to euros. Did I say dollar? Yeah, maybe. Euros.
Diego?
No, my name is Giacomo Scassellati and I'm Italian. So my question touches on another structural transformation that maybe you haven't talked about, maybe a more local one, the French-German couple, which has long served Europe as its center of gravity. The couple was based on an equilibrium, let's say military and political power on one side and economic power on the other side. Today, Germany's economy is 50% larger than France's, but in 2030, its defense budget will be 100% larger than France. And at the same time, Berlin seems to having forgotten its structural and strategic constraint that has long touched German power. So my question to you is, if the traditional Franco-German framework is no longer viable because of these asymmetries that can no longer produce, let's say, a genuine partnership of peers, what could replace it? And from the perspective of the ECB and the long-term coherence of the economic and monetary union, can Europe remain stable without a balanced political core? Or maybe should it consciously accept Germany as the new natural center of gravity, maybe a Piedmont of Europe, capable of providing unity through leadership exercised with a European vocation? Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. Things are changing, and they're changing fast, So when I look at the latest military statement and positioning that has been recently taken, that includes France, Germany, the UK, in certain respects, Poland, this is a new configuration, right? If I look at the extension of relationship between your country and other players in Europe, this is also a new development that I think should be very welcome. I would not take things for granted and assume that the economic strength of any member states is forever. I think there are business models that are being revisited. I think there are efforts that will have to be undertaken, structural reforms that will be required. I think Germany is undertaking some of that, is using its balance sheet more than it ever did before for defense purposes. I also hope that there will be a path towards joint effort and possibly joint financing when it comes to common good purposes. Defense comes to mind as one that would be particularly welcome in order to be more all together and not just a couple of two countries leading the game. So we should not be held hostage to, calibration of the past, architecture that we were accustomed to. I would beg to differ with you that the Franco-German couple has not been always a perfectly functioning engine. And I can assure you that the Euro system, which brings together now 21 countries and which seems to be attractive to a couple more countries that are talking at the moment, is not something that is a factor of Germany and France operating in a particular equilibrium. I think all member states matter, all of them.
I think we'll take one more question from the student, Svana Berger. Sorry, you're at the back.
Thanks. My name is Svana. I'm from Germany, and I have a question regarding young people's view in the European Union. So many young Europeans are very concerned with the rising cost of living. So if you look at the Eurobarometer, for instance, 41% rank rising cost of living as the major concern of their future, which is interesting because peace and stability only ranks second with 30%. So we have those rising costs of living that go hand in hand with the housing prices where rents are outpacing incomes. So we spend much more on housing than previous generations. So regarding those pessimistic trends, I was wondering what your message is to us young Europeans. Thanks.
I'm glad you mentioned housing, because I think that in all member states, without much variation, and particularly in large cities which have universities, and as a result, many students, housing is a huge issue. And I think that it's a matter that policymakers have to take on urgently, because it's just not fair that once you've completed your studies and you're about to embark in professional life, you simply cannot afford to have even a little studio, let alone a 2-bedroom apartment if you have a child. So I hope it's not for a central bank. I can't do much of anything about that. But I think that when you have a dialogue with policymakers, when governments set their priorities, I think that is a top-notch priority as far as their domestic market is concerned. They will have security priorities, defense budgets, and all that. And yes, it is a necessity. But housing for young people is something that has to be top priority for them. On the cost of living, what can I say? We work with numbers, we work with statistics. We have very, very acute sensors in all supermarkets in the euro area in order to identify, the price of goods, the price of services, the price of transportation. And I have no reason to believe that it is 10 times more than what is being measured. But I know that the perception, number one, and number two, the specific items that you are particularly sensitive to, including housing, including food, is something that is perceived as progressing too fast.
We're fast running out of time, and I'm sure the students will have many more questions to ask. I would like to give the floor to at least one faculty member, and that's Professor Michael Plummer, sitting here in the second row, was close to Bob Mandel, and he was also the director of the school for a number of years, and he's an economist. So I'll give the floor to Mike Plummer.
Thanks, Alessandro. I actually had the honor of overlapping with Bob here as a faculty member when I first joined. Not when he was writing the optimal currency area stuff, mind you.
You were not here in 61.
More recently than that. But Bob was a big advocate of economic cooperation, and I think he would have enjoyed very much your remarks this evening. He was very much in favor of free trade, but also exchange rates and, exchange rate cooperation and these sorts of things. So if I can channel my inner Bob and ask you about the European Central Bank, if you see this is a problem, our currency misalignments are a problem, do we have in place the right means to address them? We really don't have an international monetary system. Is the ECB concerned about that?
I'm not going to express any views on exchange rate because, yeah, you thought so. We monitor exchange rate. Obviously, they matter in terms of transmission to inflation. I think what is being looked at the moment by the G7 and the G20 is more the issue of the excessive unbalances, and there is a relationship between that and the exchange rate, and how exchange rates can eventually be used by some countries that will either accentuate or reduce excessive imbalances. So I hope that the work being conducted under the leadership of Hélène Rey for the G7 and by, I think it's Australia, Korea, and another countries to feed the G20 with some thinking and consideration. I hope that that will turn out to be, number one, good consideration, thoughtful recommendations, and ones that can be implemented and taken up by the leaders. But this is something that is for the coming months. Now, because you've been around for a little while, and I'm not suggesting, no, I'm going to ask you something very personal. My husband asked me to ask a senior professor at the university whether Giorgio Bernini is somebody that you know. Is he still alive? Okay.
Yeah, he's the father of the current minister of university, I think. The current minister of university, Anna Maria.
He was an expert in arbitration, wasn't he? He was an expert in arbitration. Thank you. That was my only question to you.
I think this will end the proceedings. I'll pass the floor back to the rector for a word of thank you.
Well, it will be very short. It will be very short. I think we have all had the opportunity of listening to a wonderful, thought-provoking lecture. And I think, Madam President, that you could judge from the questions that you got that indeed it forced us to rethink a number of points, and that's the very purpose of deliberation in an academic environment. So I really want to express our warm gratitude for this tour de force, and also the wish that we will have the opportunity of seeing you again in a not too distant future for continuous discussions on those issues. Thank you very much.